for All, one of the 100 most influential African Americans 2014. So we were very excited that she said yes, she was available for this event, and so she's going to talk to us about improving management of working landscapes through understanding the role of culture. So we can help me welcome Nikki.
There are more of you here than I was anticipating. So I only have 20 handouts for the later part of the session, so get friendly with whoever's next to you because you'll be sharing whatever you're looking at. I want to start with some questions because I arrived at 12:30 and I would love to know what you've been experiencing that's top of mind for you, first of all. And second of all, I would love to know why you're here for this particular session. What's top of mind? Yeah.
I guess for me it'd be where this movement's going to head and gain traction and start to really take over as far as mind shift in society, really, and how it can scale.
Thank you. Yeah.
I just came from the permaculture convergence a couple of weeks ago, and first of all, the cultural diversity there is much richer than it had been, a few years ago, and the indigenous voices were very, very strong at this one, and it was amazing to the conversations that have been coming out of the just all of the voices that are in the room now, and I want to know how to be more. I don't have language around this. I want to know how to get more voices in the conversation.
Yeah.
And I really, yeah.
More voices in the conversation.
More voices in the conversation.
All right, 1 and 2.
I've seen a lot of connection between social justice and environmental justice and the growing need for that. And I'd like to see and hear how that's actually getting into like land management.
Great.
So we were just talking before coming over here, like reconciling the need for more social and economic justice in agriculture in this field with the fact that society is not really willing to pay for all the incredible services that are being provided by so many people that are ranching, farming and ranching this way. So how do we reconcile that? How do we change that?
Yes. Just a little topic. Just a small little topic. Okay, I'm going to start with a story. Why I am here on a ranch. When I grew up in Los Angeles and wore heels to the grocery store. That's how I roll. I got into environment and environmental justice, I think, because I was raised in a family that was a no-waste family. And it's kind of old school no-waste, right? My grandmother used to say, if you're wasting something, you're not doing something right. So it wasn't like I grew up on a farm. We grew up gardening. But my connection to the earth was more of you're an animal in a habitat and be respectful to your habitat kind of relationship. And so throughout the course of my career, I have kind of split between food systems and climate change because I saw food systems as the gateway drug to being an environmentalist for people who are not in the environmental mindset. But then climate change, we're not going to have air to breathe and such. So it would be important to focus on the climate. And I spent a lot of my career bouncing back and forth between the two. From Slow Food USA and food or Green for All Climate, Slow Food USA food, People's Grocery Food Justice, back to Green for All and climate. And finally, I needed a way to integrate it. The story wasn't big enough. And I was in this question mark in early 2015 when I showed up at Tomcat Ranch for a workshop on soil carbon sequestration. What is that? But I got invited to this workshop by the Business Alliance of Local Living Economies, which feels significant, right? It's a local economic development organization that invited me to a soil carbon sequestration workshop and has a lot of social justice folk who focus on food as a part of their fellowship. So we were a contingency of this workshop. When I got there, what I discovered about soil carbon that really inspired me was the fact that it's actually, so for some context, working at the national level in climate change is pretty scary because scientists in DC are pretty convinced that we're going to die, just basically. If you talk to any of them at any events, they will pull you, once they have a few drinks, they're basically like, yeah, we're going to be underwater, we're going to die. Because we're not going to stop emissions anytime soon. And with the amount of carbon we already have in the atmosphere, we're going to go way past 2 degrees Celsius raise anyway. And there is no political will right now to change any of that. So they were terrified. And for someone like me, who works primarily in social justice, that was terrifying. So then what's going to happen to us, to my folks, to my family? So there was something of an existential crisis that I was in when I came to soil carbon sequestration. And to look at these numbers about how much carbon could be sequestered if we just treated our land the right way, it really hit me that the carbon cycle was not top of mind for me. I'd been working with carbon most of my career, and the sequestering side of the cycle was nowhere to be found in my consciousness. Reducing emissions was, but not sequestering carbon. So I learned all of this, found out about holistic land management and what's possible with soil, and said, okay, great, my focus is urban people of color. How do I fit in here? And the response was basically, we know that you fit. It's still, it's an evolving conversation. So I wanted to contribute to said evolving conversation. And that's what I've been doing for the last 2 years, is trying to contribute to said evolving conversation and bring some of these conversations together. One of the main luckily, Sally Calhoun believes in all of this. So because of the Globetrotter Foundation, we were able to engage some of these questions very directly. In partnership with the Carbon Cycle Institute and Fibershed in late 2015, we did a convening at the Occidental Arts and Ecology Center and brought together some regenerative ag folk, 1 or 2 food justice folk, and said, okay, how does this all fit together? Let's talk about the Healthy Soils Initiative statewide. Let's talk about holistic land management. Let's talk about social justice. Let's talk about environmental justice. What are the intersections and how do they fit together? And the conversation was incredibly rich and very broad. And one of the things that came up is that we don't really have a framework for talking about this stuff together, right? That there's a bunch of ideas and everyone is coming from different experience levels, but there is no lowest common denominator from which we could bring very disparate groups of people together and start a conversation. We need that lowest common denominator when it comes to soil health in particular, which is interesting for me because there are organizations like Movement Generation that have done really good work around climate and agroecology and urban communities and resiliency. But I have become a soil nerd, completely random. Me and the microbes are in love. And I wanted to know how I could be in love with microbes in a way. So sorry. Not good. Shut up. I wanted to know how I could be in love with microbes and still be in love with my people at the same time. So from that convening in September 2015, the idea to develop this framework came up, a way of talking about this, starting with the people who already work at the intersection of social justice and environmental justice and agriculture. How do you think about soil health? What's top of mind for you? Do you know that you're doing soil carbon sequestration? Do you know that you could get money to do that? Do you know that the state now has money to pay for soil health? And do you know that some of this money is earmarked for disadvantaged communities? How does all of that fit together? What would it take for you to access those funds? We interviewed 12 folk across the state of California. At least me or Tori Estrada from the Carbon Cycle Institute was in person with these interviews so that we could get the feel of where people work. In northern Sacramento, we interviewed Martha Guzman, who works at the state level, and we interviewed someone from the Community Water Center. We interviewed someone from the Center for Race, Poverty, and the Environment that does work in the Central Valley. We interviewed the head of the San Joaquin Sustainable Agriculture Collective. We interviewed someone from the Social Justice Learning Institute down in Los Angeles, which is very interesting. They started out as an education for young black men organization and ended up being food justice because that's what the young black men in Los Angeles were interested in. We interviewed someone from the Los Angeles Food Policy Council, from Los Angeles Compost, from Urban Tilth, which is in Richmond, food justice organization, from Communities for a Better Environment, which is a food justice organization, and from Asian Pacific Environmental Network. So it's spread between environmental justice, food justice, general social justice and racial justice work, and then straight up ag. Because the Nikki, who manages the San Joaquin Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, she like did the Santa Cruz farming program. So she's hardcore about agriculture. Has her little carbon cycle, like she has this game that she plays with people to teach them about the carbon cycle, and she carries that with her because of how often it comes up when she's in conversation. Badass, basically. So this paper is not yet public, but what I have for you, because y'all are special, is the first draft of the executive summary for us to look at. I'm going to go through this with you in terms of what we came up with, and then we're going to get into small group conversations about what you've heard, what it provokes for you, where you would like to go deeper, because part of the point of this paper was to start the conversation, to start with common language and framework, because this stuff is really complex. And as we proceed with having this common language and this common framework, the hope is that we can have projects on the ground that are working at this intersection, doing it really well, that can then forge that bridge between, right now we're focused on, well, I'm focused on government money, because there's a lot of it, and they're sitting there really not knowing how to distribute this money to be for the benefit of disadvantaged communities. There's a lot of complexity there. And if they got clearer on that, how could we actually get economic development funds to go toward this stuff? That's where my mind always goes, is money, and getting money to the people. So go ahead and take one per couple of people. If you don't get one, that's okay, because this paper should be public in the next 2.5 weeks. This is just a preview for you. So, as this paper is being passed out, before everybody has a copy, check in from, I'm going to pause there and see what came up for you listening to what I just said. Anything that was provoked, questions, comments, thoughts?
Excited?
Excited. Okay. Yeah.
Just what you said about the climate scientists, it feels more like a challenge than a sentence, you know, and your response and other people's responses to that is pretty thrilling. Just, you know, how do we work with this?
Yeah.
One of the things that comes up for me repeatedly is sort of a personal challenge of trying to build, you know, a livelihood in this kind of work without it becoming a conversation about how do I make income for me, when it's really about like building relationships and basically trying to create those conduits for the funding that we know is out there or we're hoping is out there, and finding ways to channel those resources, whether it's financial resources or human resources, or like all of those pieces, you know, the 8 forms of capital sort of concept. How to channel those into projects so that we can create opportunities for people, rather than walking into a space and being like, hey, I'm looking for a job in sustainable agriculture. Like managing that balance when with Donovan, we were talking earlier about basically how to get paid for things like grazing work. It's really hard to make people understand that value. And just negotiating that sort of balance between trying to look after our own needs and trying to look after the needs of our community and the earth and soil and everything. So.
Yes. And it is a balance, not either or. Thank you for that. Any other thoughts or comments? Yeah.
So one of the things when I work with an at-risk population, one of the things that like when I
You work with what population?
an at-risk population,
Uh-huh.
so low socioeconomic status,
Yeah.
food justice, or food insecurity. And so on the project that I work on, when we get them to grow food, for a lot of them, there's a when they see growing food, they see this as something that like somebody in poverty should be doing, and that will trap them working with the land, going back to the land movement. They want to move up, they want to earn money, and they don't see that as a viable source of income, nor as a viable source of livelihood. It's something they would rather get away from.
So not seeing it as a viable source of income, especially to make the kind of money you can make in California to afford anything. All right, we're going to get started. So if you have any other comments, save them for the small groups. I already saw people flipping through, and that's why I printed out these 3 pages, because when you get into the small groups, you'll have a couple of copies of it to be able to look through. Instead of reading this word for word, I'm going to get into some of the implications and some of the deeper conversation that came up in the interviews. So when it comes to soil health as environmental justice in the San Joaquin Valley, the things that are written here are things that you would know if you worked in agriculture. Soil fumigants are an issue, compost is an issue, all of the things that could be soil organic matter that are just discarded as waste. The workforce development and the wildfire management is interesting, but I'll hold that until the end. One of the big things that came up when we were doing these interviews in the Central Valley is the carbon cycle. You're going to hear me say that over and over again. I'm slightly obsessed with the carbon cycle at this point, because there's a coalition that the San Joaquin Sustainable Agriculture Coalition is a coalition of environmental justice organizations that are working in the Central Valley with farm workers and with people to ensure that people who are working in agriculture in the San Joaquin Valley are healthy and well cared for. There has been a lot of work done over the last few years to ensure that this coalition is skilled up on the carbon cycle and is skilled up on agriculture, because that gap was there in the beginning. It was a bunch of environmental justice groups who were used to thinking about people, and the people they happened to be working with were working in agriculture. It wasn't that they went to work on agriculture in the Central Valley. These were statewide organizations that had done justice work in urban areas primarily. And so them thinking about how to skill up an environmental justice coalition in soil health in a way that's going to be understandable and explicit is difficult. This paper is contributing to that. It's contributing to work that's already been done. And the carbon cycle is really key. It's connecting the dots. It's looking at work that the Community Water Center is doing. And when we did that interview with them, they didn't think about the work they were doing as improving soil health. There was money that they could have access to do the work they're already doing that is positively impacting people. And improving soil health is a side effect of what they're doing. So this is an interesting conversation when it comes to co-benefits, because there's a lot of co-benefits to working on healthy soil, but that means that soil is in the middle, and then you think about co-benefits as the spokes of the wheel. But what if the co-benefit is in the middle, looking at different communities of color? That's what we found consistently. That communities were working on the co-benefit separately and then not connecting it back to soil health. And so they were missing out on money and opportunities, and more importantly, on framing that could help build a broader coalition. So when it comes to soil health as environmental justice in the San Joaquin Valley, that was the biggest thing that came up, is how do we have a framing that allows this coalition to see themselves as part of a larger movement. Now, some of the complexity that I will throw in there. This is being recorded, right? Sure. Okay. Reset. So one of the complexities that's in there is immigration, right? Is that when it comes to farm workers and farm worker rights, immigration rights is a huge thing there. And there's a lot of farm working organizations that are working on immigration that are also working on ag because they're fighting for farm workers, but then advocating on behalf of the soil in addition to that just feels like too much. You know, because if you confuse the message, which is the same thing that climate change people say. Of course we know about the carbon cycle. Talking about sequestration and carbon drawdown confuses the message. These oil folk are way too big. We have to be singularly focused and clear if we're going to beat them. So that, to me, signals the communications issue, which gets into this next section. greening urban landscapes. I kind of came into this thing from this communication standpoint, because in movement building, that's how the impossible happens, is really good communication. So, greening urban landscapes, this is where my personal opinion comes into play, so that is a disclaimer. Because what I'm about to say does not come up as explicitly in the interviews, but it is something I feel very strongly about, which is this first point, protecting democratic process and natural resource management. California, in particular, but a lot of other states in the union, have histories of land grabs, which is how the state and how agriculture got formed, right? Is increasing consolidation of different pieces of land until basically you're looking at serfdom. And in California, in the Central Valley, this big consolidation of land is true. But what that means is that if fewer and fewer people own the land, and then the people who are working on the land don't really have a voice, and then 75% of people who live in the state are going to be living in cities. What that means is there is no democratic process around how we manage our natural resources. It's not top of mind about protecting the democratic process around managing natural resources. Even the politicians don't really know about soil from a lived experience kind of way. The number of people who are going to have hands in the dirt, lived experience, understanding of natural landscapes is shrinking and getting smaller and smaller. And more importantly, especially when it comes to ag tech and where money is going and precision agriculture and all of that, the respect for people having their hands in the dirt. The functional nature of that is becoming more important than the more subjective understanding that you can't really know something unless you touch it, see it, smell it, taste it, right? And ecosystem management, I've developed profound respect lately for how utterly complex managing ecosystems is, and how much this science around soil is constantly evolving. So, a bit of a rant. But when it comes to protecting democratic process for natural resource management, that's one of the reasons why urban gardening is so important. That's one of the reasons why demonstration projects in urban communities is important. But right now, that pathway of getting people involved in urban agriculture as a political exercise to prepare them to participate in the democratic process around natural resource management, so that things like the Healthy Soils Initiative are deeply informed, that link is not being formed. And that came up in the interviews as well, in some of the environmental justice side, is that a vision for managing agriculture and the power building strategy for a lot of environmental justice organizations doesn't have a 50 to 100 year vision for natural resource management and for the management of land. And so they're not power building around it. They're power building around the city, when so many of those communities are 1 to 2 generations away from actually having hands in the dirt. And that's a problem everywhere, the lack of the 50 to 100 year view that incorporates urban and rural communities together. So that came up a lot when it comes to greening urban landscapes. One other thing I'm going to bring up, the only thing I think in terms of lifting up is this just transitions and job creation. That came up in both rural communities and in urban communities. That if natural resource management was a broader concept and was within a broader context, how to put people to work doing natural resource management could be a collective conversation, which means that pots of money from all of these, from wildfire prevention, from water management, from all these different sectors at the state level, could be put toward a collective jobs pot that goes everywhere. And if people are really well trained in how watersheds function, watersheds as being the regions that I'm talking about, then there would be jobs that cross urban and rural. That came up in one of the interviews pretty strongly. It's not just about bringing urban people to rural and bringing rural people into the urban. It's about having a pathway that goes back and forth consistently so that people actually understand what regions look like. Finally, when it comes to this regional approach, regional democratic structures do not currently exist. And unless regional democratic decision-making structures exist, no one will know how to disperse or distribute resources regionally. So that came up really strongly. Finally, so I'm aware of time, in terms of conclusions, connecting the dots, as really being this vision process around power building for urban and rural communities working collectively on agriculture and holistic land management and natural resource management in a way that holds justice at the center. And when talking about justice, something that came up actually after the interviews, it's been something of an echo, is that there's an opportunity right now to really see what has happened to rural white working Americans in particular, and what has happened to urban people of color in a larger conversation when looking at natural resource management. That the healing of regional divides and the bridging of urban and rural communities can create a much larger basket around reconnecting race and class again as a much broader conversation. When race and class right now in the mainstream conversation are pretty far apart. They're really far apart. And they haven't actually been that far apart. And for anybody who needs just a little bit of historical and systemic racism 101, you know, sometimes all of us do. Race as a social construction came up so that people would organize against their economic interests because their identity was more important than their economic interests, right? White indentured servants and African slaves were a pretty strong unit and were prepared to overthrow the country. When the people at the top were like, we gotta keep these folks apart. They're organizing for their economic interests. So there was a very systematic way of emphasizing race, and more importantly, emphasizing that Africans weren't human. We were chattel, we were 3/5 of a human being, we weren't worth interacting with because we weren't human. It actually had to go that deep to get people to organize against their economic interests, right? And so to think about that historical and systemic context, and then to think about the way we treat ecosystems in tandem with that, and how ecosystems are not respected, they're not seen as living, breathing organisms that are deserving of respect. There's a lot of parallels there. So bringing together this race and class conversation around culture is profoundly important. And communities that have a history of organizing know how to do that. The end. So when it comes to commentary, we're going to get in small groups of about 5 or 6 people. So feel free to either just turn to the group behind you or move your chairs in a circle. You're going to talk for 5 minutes. We need more time, we need more time. 5 minutes just reacting to what you heard. And then we're going to come back and we're going to report back. 4 minutes? Yeah. 3 more minutes. That is your last sentence. Coming back.
The last thing we landed on was that we've made some leaps and bounds in different areas, but at least what we're talking about today of like trying to get all these different separate entities and moving parts together, it's like it seems like we've all reached a front where we're just kind of like, okay, who's gonna take the next step? And like who and what does that mean? Where's the intention? How do we focus?
So there's people doing different types of work, and there's ideas about where to go next, and who's actually going to take up the mantle and do it. Right. Especially the cross-collaborative stuff. Right. Because everybody's got their own thing to focus on. Mm-hmm. Word. Other, yes?
Sure. We touched on a ton of stuff, mostly appreciation of you. ecofeminism and how we relate to women in general. So that was a really cool parallel that you pointed out. And then you've been working a lot in kind of like with different communities and how the movement so far has felt very isolated and small pushes forward instead of this big picture, how do we all come together and think of all these different communities who are hurting but with very different lived experiences. And how to kind of bridge forward when people don't necessarily have levels of empathy but feel very hurt where they are right now. Yeah, how do we make it just experiences?
So I'm hearing the role of the feminine and women in this. I'm hearing that different groups, you didn't say this explicitly, but it felt implied that different groups who have been dealing with historical and systemic oppression may come from different backgrounds.
Right.
And so the trouble with empathy when it comes to very different experiences of oppression, how do you bridge that? Yes.
Yeah, I think the discussion in our group was the how to funnel this process in a way that doesn't streamline it but keeps the complexity of the carbon cycle and the potential that those of us that are actually working on the ground doing the work are the ones that need to be supported and not like the giant list of NGOs that is also doing very important work. However, it's, you know, when I heard who you were interviewing, it was like representatives and not the actual people working on the ground. So like one of my main concerns with this is that the NGOs who have the capacity to do the grant writing and to do the work will be the ones that will get a raise in their salary instead of the money actually funneling down to doing the work that actually really needs to be done on the ground. And then, because, a rancher like ourselves, we don't have a staff of people that are going to go to Sacramento or, go places, so who really represents us. And then secondly, just sort of a cultural stigma around working, laboring on the farm and how, a lot of people of color, we work in areas of really large Hispanic populations. The youth, wants to move away from that and not, follow in the footsteps of their parents who were, laboring on the farm, so they don't really see that connection with the food and the nutrition and the cooking and the gardening because they, they want a different life for themselves.
So, point one, I heard that concern in general that is everywhere, even reflected in this paper, are that nonprofit and NGO organizations that have the capacity to do research and writing and the thinking things are the ones who get resources and who are able to set the tone and set the table. And then the practitioners who are really hands in the dirt working the land get left out of that and don't actually get the resources they need to be fully healthy and thriving.
Yeah.
So that's point one. Point two over here is the stigma around working with the hands and actually doing manual labor.
It was complex back here.
Yeah.
Oh, and then the other point is that through this process, people, people's brains being linear and simplifying things, and it being so diluted that it really doesn't do any good anyway. So how do you manage the complexity and keep the complexity as it actually gets to the ground level application? That was the third point.
Got it. So as this streamlining and the simplifying tries to happen to bring people together, how do you not just totally make it fluff and hot air? Because it doesn't have any practical application anymore because you're trying to make such a big tent and keep it applicable to what's happening on the ground.
Keep it complex.
While keeping it complex. I hear that. Are they reporting back?
more at, correct me if I'm maybe wrong, like, if we looked more closely at how deeply at how we treat ourselves, how we treat people around us, and how that reflects on how we treat ecosystems. And then just the incredible opportunity that we have in having you here and that you chose to be here in a community of people that has this set of tools that can directly address those issues of how do we communicate with each other, how do we set meaningful goals that actually get the work done, and continue to look after like the care of the people doing that work. Sorry.
Other reflections came up in the groups? Okay. So having heard that, I have a couple of reflections, and also when I was doing my little birdie flitting around and listening to people. And then, because I want to make sure we've got 10 minutes, so then I want to leave a few minutes for questions, if you have any questions for me before we depart. So, reflection number one is about practitioners, because this came up a lot, actually. The thinkers and the doers. Where do the resources flow? This, in movement building, this has been a problem from the very beginning, right? And for me, in terms of like my African American studies background, this is like back to Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. You know, Du Bois trying to have people go to liberal arts school, Booker T. Washington being like, they need to know how to build things. What are you doing? And this balance. And the fact that I come from that from a racial justice perspective is very interesting. Because my version of that conversation is young black men coming out of prison who are reentry folk. What does it take for them to be out in front and for them to be fully resourced? And how different are they from the African American leader who runs a national civil rights organization who talks to Congress people all the time, right? What is the bridge between those two? And how do they make sure they're always in connection? And I just actually had a meeting with Fibershed yesterday, and it was astonishing to me how common the frame was around farmers and ranchers and people who are actually doing the work on the land and those who advocate for them. So one of the reasons why, all of that was why me putting my own opinion in there around democratic process was such a strong thing. Because that's actually, that gap is why community organizing exists. It's kind of where it came from. Because it actually takes work for people who occupy different sectors to be in communication with one another. It takes focus to manage the conflict that arises in that, because there will be conflict, trust. And that was actually the second thing I was saying, is conflict management. Because this is movement building for me, because the powers that be and the things that are being confronted are very huge. And when there's money power and there's people power, you ain't got billions of dollars. You got people power. And what it takes for people to stay in power together is super sophisticated infrastructure to keep them together. And movements that have been successful invest in that kind of infrastructure. Movements that sputter out don't invest in that kind of infrastructure. So that's really something that I'm interested in, especially after these interviews, is that's kind of always been, that's been a personal interest of mine, is being the swivel between folks and looking at what conflict exists, how both sides can be heard, how they can both get their needs met, and being the glue that holds things together as an organizer. So with that, I will pause and then see about questions. Oh, we got 3. Ask. No. So we're gonna ask 2 questions and 2 questions. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Can you talk more about that infrastructure?
That's how much.
Great. And then I'll answer that. And then what was your question?
My question was, a lot of times when you have, either individuals or groups who are united around a common cause, say, a person or a system that's oppressing them, and then that goes away, suddenly the conflicts which were dormant between the people who were collaborating surface, and the thing ends up tearing it apart. So that might be what you're talking about with infrastructure, but if it wasn't, I wanted to include that in the question. How do you build relationships around, rather than we have this shared problem or shared foe, how do you build these lateral relationships that are going to not just sustain, but continue to improve after the situation is resolved. Make
I
sense?
think I got that. What you're saying,
Go ahead, sorry.
I just want to repeat that back. So what you're saying is building relationship based on a common enemy or a fight is one thing.
Yes.
But then once the fight has been resolved,
Yes.
how do you build lasting relationship beyond just a fight or a conflict?
Yes.
Okay,
I have a really similar question to that. Can I just add something to it?
please. And then we're going to get to, okay.
So I was just thinking about the Dakota Access Pipeline and how it has brought together this group of people who've never come together, but they're coming together around crisis and sort of like how do you bring people together not in a moment of crisis, and sort of differentiating those two things is sort of where my question was. So just adding on to his, how do you work in that context, not in a moment of crisis?
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, maybe just an observation of a question that, within the agricultural community, farmers and ranchers, there's a huge divide and disconnect. There's this group of people here that get it about the ecosystem and about healthy soils, but there's a huge other part of the group that are still so enamored with big ag and chemicals and all that, and they don't, they choose not to get it right now and understand what they're doing. They're killing the soil and killing us and also. And so to bring those folks on that and be educated, right, that disconnect needs to be bridged also. That's a tough one. Maybe as tough as this other work that we're talking about here today.
So you're talking about the gap that currently exists between regenerative agriculture, holistic land management folk, and folk that are like, but chemicals make money,
The
and
Monsanto
I can feed my family.
cycles. Yeah.
Okay,
Okay.
we can answer that one quickly.
Okay.
So when it comes to infrastructure, what I would say is that different groups do it differently, and there are really good examples of infrastructure happening right now. There's a reason why Black Lives Matter was in Forbes as one of the top 20 businesses of this last year. It's because of their infrastructure, because they've managed to build a highly functional, which for movement building around police brutality, let me tell you, that is not something we take for granted. Alicia Garza and Patrice, who started the thing with a hashtag, have pods of like 30 different units across the country that are able to, independent of each other, make their own decisions about what they take on under a common platform and stay in communication enough on a regular basis to process conflict. So when it comes to the actual physical infrastructure, it's just an improvement on traditional community organizing, which is do one-on-ones to figure out how people communicate, what's the best way to communicate, what you're upset about right now, what you're happy about right now. Get all that information in one place, see what the common threads are, and then have enough staff power to manage all of it. That's it. And now we have technology to make that much easier and have fewer people be able to do that. But it just takes investing in relationship care. So that's thing one when it comes to infrastructure. It's not rocket science, but it does require time and it requires investment. The other thing that I would say that separates those who do it well from those who do it better is specific attention to interpersonal dynamics and emotional intelligence. Really good organizers know the difference between what you're saying you're upset about and what you're actually upset about. And being able to listen with that kind of ear and be able to not get personally triggered by whatever you disagree with that they're saying and address their need, because your job is not to be there to get upset about whatever you're bringing personally. Your job is to facilitate community and connection. To be able to do that, it takes deep leadership skills. I cannot emphasize that enough. And those are the kind of entities that I've been a part of and that I'm interested in building now, are folks that take a lot of care to train the core team really well on emotional intelligence and Gestalt organizational development. We've got systems and tools to know how to deal with people, and then just deploying them with whatever issue you're actually dealing with. And the last thing I will say about that on a personal note is that it took me a long time to be able to look someone in the eye who didn't actually believe in the inherent value of African Americans and separate how because that makes me feel a certain way. The first time someone called me a nigger to my face, I started shaking. And it was like, I had a physical reaction to that, and I almost couldn't engage after that. But what it takes for me to have the stamina to take something like that in, to erect an appropriate boundary so that I stay safe, but still do the work of extending a hand where I can, that's sophistication. So I would just say that, have the physical infrastructure and have the personal infrastructure and build that. So that is the end. But I will be here for a couple of minutes because I think it's 2:30 and it is 2:30 on the